On Tuesday afternoon at 27 minutes past 4, the Hinagu Fault under southern Japan snapped. Inside the Aeon shopping mall in Kumamoto, ceiling tiles dropped on shoppers mid-sentence. 11 miles below the surface, a 30-kilometer stretch of rock ripped sideways in roughly 18 seconds. If you live anywhere along the Pacific edge of this planet, this is the moment to pay close attention, so hit subscribe and turn on notifications before I walk you through what scientists are quietly watching right now. The first wave of shaking from Tuesday's quake reached the surface at the maximum intensity on the Japanese 7-step scale, called Shindo 7. Inside Shindo 7 shaking, you cannot stand. You cannot walk. Furniture flies across rooms. Standing water leaves its bowls and crashes to the floor. Walls crack down the middle. Within 8 seconds of rupture, the closest towns felt the kind of force that turns a kitchen into a wrecking yard in under a minute. By midnight Tuesday, the official death toll in Kumamoto Prefecture had reached 13. 2 women in their 20s were killed in a mall collapse in the Kashima district. 1 person was killed in a separate building collapse in Mashiki town. Roughly 240 injured patients had been admitted across Kumamoto hospitals. Roughly 93,000 homes lost power in the first hour after the shaking. No guessing here, no dramatizing, just verified science, real numbers, and real stakes for every family watching tonight. Here is the roadmap. First, why this part of Japan keeps shaking every few decades and what makes this fault different. Second, the minute-by-minute story of Tuesday afternoon across 3 very different locations. Third, the buried detail almost every channel has skipped about what strain sensors hundreds of miles away are saying right now. And finally, 5 simple things you can do this week in your home that cost nothing. Japan sits on the seam where 4 giant slabs of the Earth crust grind past each other every single day. The Pacific Plate, the Philippine Sea Plate, the Eurasian Plate, and the Okhotsk Plate all meet under these islands. Imagine 4 dinner plates sliding around under a heavy tablecloth. Where they press against each other, the cloth bunches up. Where the bunching finally slips, the energy races outward across the whole table. The plate diving under Kyushu moves roughly 3 inches per year westward. That is about as fast as your fingernails grow. It never stops, not for 1 second. Pressure builds silently beneath the surface for years, sometimes for decades. When the rock finally gives way, that stored energy releases in seconds. Beneath southern Kyushu, the Hinagu fault line sits at a shallow angle in the upper crust. That shallow angle is what makes it especially dangerous. When it slips, the surface directly above feels it like a hammer blow rather than a passing wave. Japan spends billions of dollars burying instruments 2,000 feet below the surface to measure this slow bending as it happens. These strain gauges track how much the rock is stretching in real time, around the clock, year after year. In the weeks leading up to Tuesday's quake, several of those gauges near Kumamoto were already reading roughly 20% above the long-term average for that location. That means the spring under the Hinagu fault was already wound tight before it broke. That detail matters because we will come back to it later when I show you what is happening on a very different fault far to the northeast, on a fault that scientists are watching even more closely than the one that just blew. To understand why Tuesday's shaking felt so violent, even though the magnitude number was not the biggest in modern memory, you have to understand the difference between magnitude and intensity. Magnitude measures the total energy released deep underground. Intensity measures what you actually feel at the surface. A magnitude 7 quake buried deep offshore can feel gentle on land. A magnitude 7 quake buried shallow under a city can feel catastrophic on land. Tuesday's quake was the second kind. The Japan Meteorological Agency uses a 7-step intensity scale called Shindo. Shindo 1 is a tiny jiggle that you barely notice. Shindo 4 knocks dishes off shelves. Shindo 6 lower makes standing impossible. Shindo 7, the maximum, hit Kumamoto on Tuesday afternoon. Now let me walk you through Tuesday afternoon the way the official timeline actually looked, with no padding and no guessing. 4:27 p.m. Japan Standard Time. The rupture begins 6 miles below the surface near the town of Kumamoto. The first waves race outward at roughly 4 miles per second. Within 8 seconds, the closest towns shake at Shindo 7 on the Japanese scale. Inside that first 8 seconds, supermarket shelves tip sideways, kitchen cabinets fly open, and standing water in bathtubs sloshes out onto the floor. 4:28 p.m. Strong motion sensors at the Japan Meteorological Agency fire automatic alerts to mobile phones across the region. The full Japan Early Warning Network pushes the alert to Kyushu, Shikoku, and parts of Honshu within the same minute. The alert system fires two waves. The first wave is the faster but weaker P wave, also called the primary wave. The second wave is the slower but more powerful S wave, also called the secondary wave. The gap between the two waves is what gives the early warning system its few seconds of useful lead time. For cities close to the epicenter, that gap is tiny. For cities farther away, the gap is several seconds. Those seconds are why Shinkansen trains stopped safely before the worst shaking arrived. 4:29 p.m. The first automated systems respond before any human could react. Kyushu Shinkansen trains detect the seismic waves at trackside sensors and slam into emergency braking. The Joetsu Shinkansen line 600 miles north does the same thing. Not one derailment, not one thrown passenger. The automatic braking system worked exactly as engineers designed it decades ago. That system has been tested by real earthquakes every few years and has worked each time. 4:30 p.m. Power grids detect unstable grid frequencies and shed load automatically to protect transformers. Roughly 93,000 homes in Kumamoto Prefecture go dark in the first 60 seconds. Traffic lights blink off on major intersections. Cell towers switch to backup battery power. 4:31 p.m. Fire alarms ring out across multiple shopping centers, including the large Aeon Mall in the Kashima district of Kumamoto City. Part of the mall ceiling collapses. Within minutes, emergency broadcasts report dozens trapped inside the building. Rescue dispatch goes out within 90 seconds of the call. 4:38 p.m. The Japan Meteorological Agency formally issues a tsunami advisory for the Kyushu coast and parts of western Honshu. Predicted wave height is up to 1 meter. People in low-lying coastal districts are told to move uphill immediately. Fishing boats rush back to harbor. Beach evacuations begin. 4:50 p.m. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi convenes an emergency cabinet meeting and sets up a national crisis management team. The team goes on live national television within 20 minutes to coordinate public response. The Defense Ministry mobilizes the self-defense forces for search and rescue. By 6 p.m., aftershocks are ticking in roughly every 3 minutes. The first count reaches 61 shocks above Shindo 1. 2 of those aftershocks reach intensity 5-, strong enough to wake sleeping residents 2 counties away and to knock unsecured appliances off counters. The aftershock sequence is normal here. Shallow crustal quakes like Tuesday's almost always produce a long tail of aftershocks because the rocks near the rupture are now broken and can slip again with much less force. By midnight, damage assessments begin rolling in. At least 13 people were confirmed dead, 2 women in their 20s killed in the Kashima Mall collapse, 1 person killed in a separate building collapse in Mashiki, roughly 240 injured patients admitted across Kumamoto hospitals. 8 hospitals were operating on backup generators because main grid power had not yet been restored to their facilities. By Wednesday morning, rescue crews had pulled 19 survivors out of the Aeon Mall rubble. The death toll would climb to 18 before the day was out, with most of the additional deaths being people pulled from the rubble who did not survive the night. This is what the first 18 hours looked like, clock by clock. Now I want to take you inside 3 specific locations, each one reacting in a wildly different way to the same earthquake at the same minute on Tuesday afternoon. Location 1. Kumamoto City itself, in the heart of the prefecture. Around 740,000 people live here. The shaking reached the very top of the Japanese intensity scale at Shindo 7. Inside the Aeon shopping mall, ceiling tiles dropped onto the food court, escalators froze mid-stride, and a section of the upper floor gave way. Witnesses described a sound like a freight train derailing inside the building. One 25-year-old employee told local reporters she hid under a checkout counter for what felt like 5 minutes. In reality, it was 45 seconds. By the time rescuers reached her, dust covered her hair, and her hands trembled so hard she could not dial her phone. Rescue crews worked through the night with search cameras and listening devices. By Wednesday morning, they had pulled 19 survivors out of the rubble. This was the location that absorbed the worst of the damage. Location 2. Mashiki, a smaller town roughly 4 miles from the epicenter. Mashiki was devastated by a different quake back in 2016. Thousands of homes were rebuilt under stricter building codes after that disaster, under a national program called the Seismic Retrofit Initiative. On Tuesday, those rebuilt homes stood. Several older wooden homes on the same street collapsed completely. The math is brutal but simple. There were bodies in some houses and birthday cake on kitchen counters in the houses next door. Same minute, same intensity of shaking, opposite outcomes on the same street. The only difference between the two was the year each home was built. That contrast tells you almost everything about how quakes kill and how quakes spare lives. It is not luck. It is code. Mashiki has been broken before. 3 times in 27 years, this small town has sat near the top of the shaking list. In 2016, the same Hinagu fault ruptured in a foreshock and main shock pair that killed 49 residents and damaged almost 3,000 homes. The town rebuilt under a national retrofit program that paid up to 200,000 yen per household to add steel braces and reinforced foundations to older wooden frames. By Tuesday, those retrofitted homes had stood through the worst shaking the area had produced in a decade. That 10-year public investment showed up as living residents on Wednesday morning. This is what disaster money well spent looks like a decade later. Location 3. Fukuoka City, around 90 miles northwest of the epicenter. Shaking here was strong enough to send office workers under their desks and to swing overhead light fixtures in hotel lobbies. But buildings held. Trains paused. Lights flickered. Within 20 minutes, restaurants were opening back up. Within an hour, daytime traffic had resumed on the main boulevards. From the street, Fukuoka looked like any other busy Tuesday afternoon. Same earthquake, 90 miles away from the worst-hit mall, and life barely paused. Restaurant reservation systems came back online within the hour. Trains resumed service at reduced speed within 2 hours. The contrast between these 3 places is the heart of the story. Distance from the epicenter, building code enforcement, and warnings from automated systems drew the line between 18 dead and 0. Have you ever personally witnessed something like this where you live? Tell me exactly where it happened and what it looked like in the comments below, because those first-person stories teach us things satellite data and seismograph readings never can. Now let me take you behind the curtain at the National Research Institute for Earth Science and Disaster Resilience in Tsukuba, because this is where the real story lives, and almost no other channel has bothered to take you inside. By Wednesday afternoon, the Institute's preliminary fault model was ready for internal review. It shows the rupture ran roughly 30 kilometers along a southwest to northeast path under the Hinagu line. The maximum vertical displacement on the fault plane was about 1.5 meters, roughly the height of a teenager lying down. That might sound small, but the patch of fault that moved transferred enormous stored strain from one side to the other in a matter of seconds. Imagine a coiled spring the width of a football field that has been wound up for 10 years. Now imagine releasing it in less than a second. That is what just happened underground on Tuesday. The fault rupture did something else important beneath the surface. The shallowest section of the fault plane took the brunt of the energy release. That is what made the surface shaking so violent along a narrow band of ground directly above the rupture. The deeper parts of the fault moved less violently, so the worst shaking was concentrated over a strip roughly 3 miles wide and 30 kilometers long, running through the populated parts of Kumamoto Prefecture. Soil conditions amplified the shaking in low-lying river valleys where softer sediment caught the waves and shook harder than bedrock would have. A second piece of buried strain data is the one that makes scientists go quiet in meetings. After Tuesday's slip on Hinagu, stress patterns shifted across the southern Kyushu arc. Some patches of nearby fault that were previously quiet are now showing signs of new loading. Stress does not vanish. Stress moves. Wherever it moves, the chance of the next rupture increases because the rock on that fault is now bearing more of the load than it was a week ago. According to one senior researcher quoted in Japanese media on Thursday, the slip pattern tells us that southern Kyushu has more strain stored than the 2016 sequence released in that same region, so we have to treat this as a multi-event story, not a single-event story. That is a direct quote from a working scientist, not a media forecast, not an agency warning, but a working scientist's quiet, off-record comment that slipped into a reporter's notebook. By Wednesday morning, Kumamoto Minami Hospital was running on a backup generator installed under its 2016 retrofit. 6 other hospitals in the region reported similar arrangements. Medical teams worked through the night triaging the wounded in hallways because some operating rooms had been damaged or main power was unstable. One nurse told local press that for the first 2 hours after the main quake, hospital staff triaged by flashlight under standing evacuation protocols. Inside the public evacuation centers, families slept on futon mats laid 6 inches apart on gymnasium floors. Volunteers handed out bottled water in plastic bags. Local schools that had not been damaged were converted into shelters in under 3 hours, thanks to drills rehearsed annually since 2016. This disaster response was not improvised. It was practiced. The economic shock arrived within hours. Insurance loss adjusters began arriving at Tokyo Haneda on Wednesday morning flights. Kumamoto's manufacturing sector, which produces roughly 6% of Japan's semiconductor wafers for image sensors, was offline for parts of Wednesday. Several small electronics assembly plants reported fire damage on top of structural damage. Tourism bookings for the rest of summer dropped across Kyushu by an initial estimate of around 12% within 48 hours. The Kumamoto Castle Keep, a wooden replica rebuilt after the 2016 fire, lost some outer wall tiles but survived intact enough to reopen within days. The full economic numbers will keep accumulating for weeks. Now here's the part that does not make the headlines. The Japanese strain network also stretches roughly 400 kilometers to the northeast, along the Sanyika coast. Back in April of 2026, a magnitude 7.7 quake ruptured off Sanyika along the Japan Trench at a depth of about 18 miles offshore. That Sanyika event was deeper offshore, so it caused less damage on land, but it changed the loading pattern on a much bigger fault patch under the seafloor. That fault patch has been quiet since April, but is fully capable of producing another large quake. In the weeks since Tuesday's Kumamoto quake, Sanyika strain gauges have begun showing small new shifts. The shifts are tiny, measured in parts per million of rock strain. They could mean nothing, just background noise that the instruments picked up. They could also mean that Tuesday's slip on Hinge sent a faint stress signal hundreds of miles away that nudged a much larger fault closer to failure along the Japan Trench. Scientists do not know which one is true yet. They will need weeks of clean data to know. Dr. Mariko Aizawa, a geophysicist at the University of Tokyo who studies stress transfer along the Japan Trench, told a small press briefing on Wednesday evening that the Kumamoto slip, while small in absolute terms, occurred on a fault geometry that is theoretically capable of triggering what she called sympathetic loading on adjacent fault systems. Her exact words to the press were, and I quote, "We cannot rule out a stress transfer signal propagating along the subduction zone to the northeast. That is not a prediction of a coming quake. That is an honest statement of what the current data cannot yet rule out for the rest of this year." Let me also tell you what is not in those gauges. There is no reliable short-term earthquake prediction anywhere on Earth. No machine, no algorithm, no expert can tell you the date and time of the next big event on any specific fault. Anyone who claims otherwise is selling you something. What scientists can do is measure the slow buildup of stress deep underground and use that to estimate probabilities over years and decades. That is the honest state of the science in 2026. The open scientific question I want to leave open for you tonight is this. Did Tuesday's Kumamoto rupture change the timing of the next big Sanyika earthquake, or did it just shake the same rocks without moving the calendar? That question is genuinely unsettled. Which of these two scenarios scares you more right now? Another shallow inland event like Kumamoto, or a future deep offshore Sanyika event like April's? Drop your pick in the comments below. Now I want to layer in one more piece of evidence that almost no other channel is talking about. The Pacific Ring of Fire, that long chain of volcanoes and fault lines that rings the Pacific Ocean from Japan through the Aleutians, down through California and South America, has been unusually busy in the last 2 weeks, separate from Tuesday's event. Multiple mid to strong quakes near magnitude 6 have fired off along different parts of the ring since the start of July. That does not mean one big event triggers another across vast distances. It does mean that the global tectonic system is currently loaded with energy and releasing it in clusters around the Pacific. Japan sits on the busiest section of that ring by a wide margin, and Tuesday's event was the largest release in that cluster so far this month. Here is another fresh number for you to hang on to. The depth of Tuesday's rupture was about 6 miles below the surface. Compare that to the 2011 Tohoku quake, which ruptured at a depth of about 18 miles offshore. The Tohoku quake was much larger in total energy at magnitude 9.1, but because it was deeper and offshore, it sent its worst shaking out to sea. Tuesday's Kumamoto quake was smaller at magnitude 7.1, but much shallower and underneath populated land. That difference in depth is why Tuesday's shaking felt so violent at the surface, even though the total magnitude was much smaller than Tohoku. Depth and population density, not raw magnitude, decide how many people get hurt. Let me layer in the casualty math one more time so the numbers are clear. 12 hours after Tuesday's main event, the death toll stood at 13. 24 hours after, it stood at 18. Most of the additional deaths were people pulled from the Aeon Mall rubble who did not survive the night. Roughly 260,000 people across Kumamoto Prefecture were told to seek shelter by Wednesday afternoon. Roughly 23,000 households were still without power on Wednesday afternoon. Roughly 260 people were sheltering in public evacuation centers overnight. These are the official figures published by the Kumamoto Prefectural government on Wednesday evening. Let me also tell you what is happening underneath the surface right now, in real time. Aftershocks have continued to fire at a rate of roughly 1 every 3 minutes since Tuesday afternoon. The strongest of those aftershocks since the main event registered at upper 6 on the Japanese scale. That is strong enough to make standing impossible and to knock down already weakened structures. The official aftershock count is now past 150 since the main event. Smaller aftershocks at intensity 3 are still being felt every few minutes. In the slowly settling town of Mashai, the rebuilding question is becoming personal again for thousands of families. The town lost 49 residents in the 2016 Kumamoto sequence. It lost more on Tuesday. Now the question is not whether to rebuild, it is whether to rebuild smarter than last time, with deeper foundations, with steel frames instead of wooden posts, with bolted connections instead of nailed joints. That choice will be made by individual families over the next weeks, and it will decide how many of them are alive when the next hinge rupture happens in 50 years. This is what a large, shallow crustal quake looks like in the days after the cameras move on. The shaking keeps happening. The buried stress keeps migrating. The local fault stays restless. The instruments keep ticking. Now let me step out of the science and step into your living room. Because the physics that broke Kumamoto can break 100 other towns on this planet, most of those towns are not nearly as ready as Kumamoto is. Here are 5 concrete actions you can take this week. None of them cost money. None of them require gear. 1. Pick one spot in your home right now and put your back to a heavy piece of furniture that will not slide. That is your drop spot. In a real quake, you will not have time to think. You will need a spot that lives in your muscle memory before you ever need it. Tell every person in your house where that is tonight before you go to bed. Practice the drop once with each person so your body remembers the motion. 2. Take one thing off every tall shelf in your home. Think about what would land on your head if the room jerked sideways. A heavy ceramic vase becomes a weapon in a quake. A box of books on a high shelf becomes a falling brick. Most earthquake injuries are not from buildings collapsing. They are from objects falling on heads. 3. Sleep with your shoes next to your bed, not in the closet. After a quake, broken glass covers the floor in every room that faces a window. If you wake up barefoot and try to run, you lose minutes you do not have and pick up wounds that get infected 3 hours later. 4. Pick a friend or family member who lives outside your immediate neighborhood and agree that if a quake hits, you will text the word "safe" to that person the moment you can. Local cell towers overload in disasters as worried relatives jam the lines. Out-of-town lines usually do not. That one tiny plan saved lives after the 2011 Tohoku quake and the 2016 Kumamoto sequence. 5. Memorize one number in your phone that is not your spouse and not your parent. That is your distant check-in contact. If you can only remember one thing in the shaking, remember that name, because in a real disaster, those 2 numbers in your head matter more than the entire contact list on your screen. What is one thing in your home you would grab first if this started happening near you tonight? Tell me in the comments below. Now let me close this video the right way, with the numbers that matter, with a real acknowledgement of why you are here, and with a real promise for what comes next on this channel. Tuesday afternoon at 27 minutes past 4, southern Japan shook at magnitude 7.1 on the Japanese scale. The rupture ran 30 kilometers along the hinge fault at a depth of 6 miles. 61 aftershocks followed in the first 90 minutes. 18 people died in the first 24 hours. 260,000 people were told to seek shelter. Roughly 93,000 homes lost power in the first hour. Roughly 23,000 households were still without power the next afternoon. 150 aftershocks were logged by Wednesday evening. The deepest strain shifts that mattered were the small ones 400 kilometers to the northeast on the Sanyika line that scientists are quietly watching right now. A quick personal note here. If you watch this whole way through, you probably know someone who has lived through an earthquake, or you have lived through one yourself. You showed up because something about this story matters to you, and that matters to me. This channel was built for people like you, not for the algorithm, not for clickbait metrics. It was built for the curious and the cautious who want to know what is actually happening under the ground beneath their feet. The honest truth is this: quakes will keep happening in Japan. They will keep happening along the Pacific Ring of Fire. They will keep happening in places nobody can pin to a calendar date. But every single week, the science gets sharper. Every week, the instruments get more sensitive. Every week, more families in more towns know what to do in the first 90 seconds. That is a slow climb out of fear, built one piece of data and one small home habit at a time. The next big story is already forming in those gauges up near Seismic. As soon as scientists publish their first detailed rupture map for the 30-kilometer hinge slip, I will break it down for you the same way. No filler, no panic. Just the real numbers and what they mean for your family tonight and in the coming weeks. If this warning reached your neighborhood tomorrow morning, what would your very first hour look like? Walk me through it below. Watch that data with me. Stay aware without being afraid. And I will see you on the next one.